and then to the bathroom.
Well, you know, if we need to do like, another option is if you want, we can also, like after you finish one section, we take a break and then come back and reconvene.
Okay, well, whatever.
Whatever floats your boat.
Okay.
We're just happy you're here.
What do we got here? 2, 6, 10, 14, 20.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Pastor Laura, and it is a delight to welcome you to our space. In no way was this just us. This was a group effort, and I want to thank everyone who's contributed to making this a possibility, especially you, Bob. For more information, I'm going to let Sandra introduce you, and stay around afterwards. We do have food because bribery works.
Thank you. Again, for most of you know me, but which is great to see all these familiar faces. It's not often that we're able as a conference to gather together for events like this. So, but in case anybody doesn't know me, I'm Pastor Sandra, and I am just so excited for today. Dr. Gnuse is the pastor of Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Marrero, and he is the James C. Carter, S.J., Capital One, Distinguished Professor of Humanities and Religious Studies. That's a mouthful. So he graduated with his Master of Divinity from Concordia Seminary in Exile, or CEMEX as people call it, and he received his PhD from Vanderbilt University in Old Testament Studies. He has written many, many books. The biography on the school website is out of date. He's written far more books that are listed there, as well as countless articles. And while I can say I have read most of your English language ones, I have not read the German ones, so I apologize for slacking off on not reading your German language articles. Among the books that he has written are Trajectories of Justice, What the Bible Says About Slaves, Women, and Homosexuality, The Bible and the Environment, A Cry for Justice, and No Tolerance for Tyrants, The Biblical Assault on Kings and Kingship. This is just a few of them. And in spite of the fact that 19-year-old me argued with him that his doctoral dissertation was wrong, he has been my teacher, my mentor, my colleague, and my friend. Siblings in Christ, it is my joy to welcome today the Reverend Dr. Robert Gnuse.
Got to tell you a story about that Trajectories of Justice. I use that as, in fact, I wrote that to use as a textbook in some of my classes because that way I don't have to have the students buy 3 different books at $50 each, and they can buy that one for $30. And one of my students from a couple of years prior came to me and said, Dr. Gnuse, I was on the West Bank and I went and visited a church, a Lutheran church, Salem Lutheran Church. And the preacher, they didn't know I was from Loyola. They didn't know I graduated from Loyola, but the preacher was going on about what a liberal school that was, and you shouldn't go there, and they have bad teaching and bad doctrine. And I sort of said, well, okay, I'm not going to tell them where I'm from after the service is over. And then he held up a book, and he said, this is the kind of crap they teach at Loyola. And he was waving the book around, and he said, Professor Gnuse, that was the book we used in our class. That was the book you wrote. And I said, well, you know, better to be hated than ignored. But it was that book, Trajectories of Justice, and it made it to Salem Lutheran Church. I'm so impressed. But anyway, what I've been asked to talk about are the Advent texts and some sort of historical and theological background about the Advent texts. And In this first session, I'm going to talk about Luke. Usually in Advent, the gospel readings focus on John the Baptist. And this year, this cycle, only one of the texts deals with John the Baptist. The others, well, two of them come out of the infancy narratives in Luke chapter 1, and one is Jesus' sayings about the fall of Jerusalem. So it's worth saying something about the infancy narratives, especially since these readings are coming from Luke chapter 1, and most people are not familiar with Luke chapter 1. But first of all, let me bore you with a lecture. When you talk about the Gospels, we know far less than we like to admit about anything in the Bible because they wrote those books and they didn't tell us the obvious that everybody else knew, but 2,000 years later, we don't know the obvious. So we have to do a lot of guessing in terms of background and development and that sort of thing. For the last 180 years, scholars have suspected that the first gospel written was Mark, and there's a reason why Matthew's first. That's a separate lecture. And we think Mark inherited an oral tradition about Jesus' passion because what he writes down is pretty identical to what Matthew writes down. So they both use the same oral passion narrative. Mark got sayings from somewhere. And we'll all debate about that. So he could be using the source or not. Matthew comes along, and it's pretty obvious that Matthew uses Mark because they're so close. And Matthew uses something that we theoretically call the source, or Quelle, which is the German word for source, which obviously tells you who were the first folks to kind of isolate this material. And we say that because when Luke comes along, Luke also has much of Mark's stuff, though he tinkers with it, changes it. But he has a bunch of sayings that look like, typical sort of Jesus sayings. And he has a lot of stuff that Matthew has and Mark doesn't. So starting 1800s, they figured Matthew and Luke both used an oral source called Q, and when they agree with each other against Mark, they're obviously using this oral source. Now, Mark may have used that source also because there are a whole bunch of sayings that Matthew, Mark, and Luke all have. And, again, people tinker with them, but they're pretty much the same sayings. When I say tinker, let me give you an example. This is a meaningful example. In Mark, Jesus says, "A man shall not divorce his wife lest he commit adultery against her, and a woman shall not divorce her husband for she commits adultery against him." Now, first of all, Jewish women couldn't divorce their husbands, so Jesus never would have said to a Jewish audience, wives should not divorce their husbands. He just wouldn't have said that. But that's the way Mark preserves the saying. Matthew preserves the saying, "Man shall not divorce his wife lest it be for porneia, or he commits adultery against her." Okay, they're remembering the same saying, but they've both added something. So we can compare them and say what Jesus originally said was, if a man divorces his wife, he commits adultery against her. What Jesus is probably condemning is not divorce, but men throwing their wives out, which was very, very common in a period of time from about 30 BC to 40 AD. A man could divorce his wife if she failed in her wifely duties to keep the house clean, cook the meals properly, raise the children. So a lot of guys divorce their wives, and you did it by taking your sandals and slapping them 3 times in front of the woman's face, saying, "I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you." Women couldn't do that, but men could do that. The Jewish tradition after 40 AD will change this and make it tougher for men to divorce their wives. They realized they created a problem. They created divorce that was too easy. And Jesus is not talking about divorce. He's defending women's rights. That's what's worth saying. Jesus is defending women's rights, and probably a number of the women in the Jesus movement may have been women thrown out of their homes by their husbands, and now the Jesus movement picks them up and keeps them from starving to death. So he's got a lot of anger, and so when he utters this saying, it's an impossible saying. If a man divorces his wife, he commits adultery against her. That's impossible. Adultery is a specific crime that involves sexual behavior with another person. He's making an exaggerated saying, kind of like if your hand offended, cut it off. Or it's easier for a camel to get through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to get to heaven. All Jewish teachers love to do that. They would have hyperboles and exaggerated saying. Initial point to make is, don't use this Jesus saying to articulate a church doctrine on divorce, because Jesus wasn't talking about divorce. He was talking about the abuse of women. Mark gets the saying. In Rome, women can divorce their husbands. So he adds the clause, women should not divorce their husbands, because he's a good disciple of Jesus. Jesus taught his disciples not to be literalists, but to get the point. So of course they're going to change his sayings for a later generation to get his point. So Mark's doing pretty much the same thing, but Mark's also talking to a generation of Roman Christians who think they're all going to die in 2 years. So he probably is uttering a statement, don't engage in divorce. We're going to die in our next Roman persecution anyway. Well, it didn't come. Okay. Matthew gets the saying in the 80s, and he realizes it's impractical to forbid divorce, so he adds the clause, lest it be for porneia, which is a nasty word to translate because it comes out fornication, but that's really a bad translation. We should translate it as offense, so that Matthew's saying, husbands, don't divorce your wife unless it be for an offense. What he's doing is using the same guidelines that the Jewish tradition developed 10 years after Jesus. So Matthew's saying, if Jesus were alive, he would have gone along with that decision of the Sanhedrin, because, you know, it tightened up divorce and made it better for women. Okay. Don't consult any of these sayings for divorce guidelines. Go to Paul. And that's one thing New Testament scholars say. If church wants to develop divorce guidelines, go to Paul. Paul gives guidelines, and above all, he says, I don't want there to be violence. If there's violence in a marriage, you know, it should end. Okay, I mention this not only because it's worth saying this about the divorce passages, because a lot of those divorce passages get misused by churches to condemn divorce unnecessarily, when Jesus and Paul and Mark especially were talking about protecting women, not so much divorce. The disciples who wrote the Gospels tinkered with the Jesus sayings to make them relevant for a later generation. So when you get your red letter Bible and it's got Jesus' words in red letters, okay, Jesus probably didn't say the saying exactly that way. He would have been very unhappy if his disciples would have remembered his sayings literally without updating them meaningfully for a later audience. And so that's one thing you learn in the New Testament. Gospel writers update this stuff, and they change it to make it meaningful. And we know that because different gospel writers will remember the same sayings differently. They update them constantly. All right, so Matthew, Luke, use Mark, use Q. Matthew has stuff unique to him. We call this Proto-Matthew. We don't know where it came from. Well, we don't know where anything came from, but we'd like to say especially we don't know where the Proto-Matthew came from, other than that Matthew, being a Jewish Christian, may have gotten it from Jewish Christians in Palestine. Maybe, who knows? Then there's Proto-Luke stuff, which includes the infancy narratives. Where did Luke get it from? We don't know. But we like to romantically say, and this was said, already a couple of centuries after Luke, that while Paul was in Caesarea in prison from 61 to 62 AD, Luke traveled around Palestine and picked up these stories, maybe from people who knew Jesus personally. Maybe. It's a guess. We like to be romantic sometimes. When you look at the Proto-Luke stuff in general, what you notice is if you pull it all out and look at it, you'll say, he has things that talk about Jesus reaching out to the outsider, to the poor. You just systematically go through the gospel. Jesus reaches out. Children are more important. Women are more important. Jesus heals more diseased people. We always used to like to say Luke was a doctor. He was interested in healing science. No. Luke was interested in Jesus healing people whose diseases made them unacceptable in the worshiping communities. They were outsiders, especially lepers. He heals a lot of lepers. And then when he heals the 10 lepers, story unique to Luke, who's the only one that comes back to thank him? The Samaritan. Luke deals with Samaritans. Luke has Jesus, well, when you watch this whole pattern through the Gospel of Luke, it culminates when Jesus has a dialogue on the cross with the thief on the cross, where he offers the thief on the cross presence with him in the divine realm that day. Nobody else gets a promise like that. But the worst person in the whole book gets it. The guy who's being crucified because he's probably a revolutionary or criminal. He's being crucified outside the city, which makes him, he's lost citizenship, and that's what the Greek would think. He's being crucified, and that makes his body impure. He can't be buried in a Jewish tomb. That's what the Jew would think. But he gets the greatest blessing, and he gets it given to him by the Son of God, who's hanging on a cross next to him. This is probably one of the most powerful symbols in the gospel. This guy, the lowest of the low, gets the greatest blessing given to him by somebody who's in the same condition he is. This is Luke's theme because Luke is writing to a generation of Greeks who are Christians who are pretty cocky, and Greeks tend to be that way. And Luke's saying, you have to reach out to the poor, to the slaves, to the outsiders, to the foreigners. And Luke tries to teach him the key word is agape, love. Now, in the Greek world, agape meant sentimentality. It was wishy-washy love. It meant that you loved almost anything. You would drink Mad Dog 2020 instead of a fine Beaujolais. You would go to McDonald's instead of Ruth Chris's Steakhouse. They had this image that a true Greek had virtue, had arete. And the kind of love that came with arete was eros. Love of the beautiful, love of the wonderful, love of the perfect, love of a human being worth loving. So Christians did a job on eros. After about 100 years, they turned the word to mean not love of the beautiful, but erotic, pornographic love. And agape, the word that meant sentimentality, that was the real word, because if you had agape, you loved everybody and everything. And that was the key thing. You loved everybody. In 363, Julian, an apostate emperor, wrote a letter to a friend cursing those damn Nazarenes, because he says, what do? In every city where you find Nazarenes, when somebody falls sick, they go help them. When somebody's in prison, they visit them. They enable poor, degenerate people who should die. Julian believed in survival of the fittest, and these Christians were helping everybody survive. And he said it's because of their sentimentality, said Julian. They're sentimental, agape. They love everybody. Point made. What Julian hated as a pagan was what the Christian said is the highest virtue, love of everybody. That returns us back to the infancy narratives. Matthew too has infancy narratives. In the infancy narrative, chapter 2 in Matthew, he has the wise men come to visit Jesus. In Luke, you have the shepherds. Do not focus on the baby. Focus on who comes. In Matthew, wise men, oh man, that's not really a good translation of magi. You should translate it as magicians, sorcerers, practitioners of the dark arts. These are dark people. But Matthew wants to say, they are bent to the light, and Jesus is the light. And they are the first to come. And Matthew, Jewish Matthew is saying to his Jewish audience, they were the first to come. That means we ought to go out and kind of convert some of them, don't you think? So there are those subtle hints in Matthew. Reach out to the Gentiles. The first to come to worship Jesus were Gentiles, and they were some of the worst. They were magi. Now, by the 3rd century, yeah, magi means, oh yeah, those Persian priests, and then that's when the artistic tradition begins, and you give little curly toes, and you make, but that's the 3rd century. The word magi takes on a different meaning in the Roman Empire in the 3rd century. In the 1st century, Matthew writes his gospel. It's a dark word. It's a dark word. Turn to Luke. Who are the first people to come? Shepherds. Poor, mangy, scraggly, migrant shepherds, the poorest of the poor. And then there's Luke's theme. Jesus reaches out to the poorest of the poor, and the first to come are the shepherds. So in the infancy narratives, that's look about who comes, because Matthew and Luke are staking their territory by telling the story of the first worshipers. Okay, so in 2 of our readings, we have selections from Luke chapter 1. The 4th Sunday of Advent, we have the Canticle of Mary. Let me just read this. My soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked upon his handmaid's lowliness. Behold, from now on all ages will call me blessed. The Mighty One has done great things for me, and holy is his name. His mercy is from age to age to those who fear him. He has shown might with his arms. He has dispersed the arrogant of mind and heart. He has thrown down the rulers from their thrones. Gentleman I know wrote a book with that as a title. But lifted up the lowly. The hungry he has filled with good things. The rich he has sent empty away. He has helped Israel his servant. Remember his mercy according to the promise to our fathers, to Abraham, and to his descendants forever. This is a psalm. You can take this, you can go through the Psalter, you can find almost all of these phrases and expressions in the psalm. We have 150 psalms in the Psalter, but there were probably a whole lot more than those. And we actually have something called the Psalms of Solomon. We have an additional 8 in a little book that probably didn't get included in the Psalter because they wanted to stop at the number 150. They were into nice round numbers. So if these books were written too late, they didn't make it into the Psalter. Probably in the days of Jesus, Psalms are still being crafted. As you look at this, it has a genre. You would say this is a Thanksgiving hymn. Okay. Hymns of praise. You praise God. Da, 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 da. Generic praise. Lament hymns. The most common hymn in the Psalter, 46 of them. You complain to God because 1, you're suffering, and or 2, God, you've really made life miserable for me. Why the hell are you doing this? And 3, my enemies. And the enemies can be political enemies. They can be my friends who laugh at me. They can be people who say, you're suffering, you must have sinned, this is why you're suffering. But some kind of enemies. You ask for God to deliver you. You give 3 imperatives: help, save, deliver me. Sometimes each one is a sentence long. And then you say, and if you deliver me, I will sing your praise in the temple, blah, 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 blah. And then you say, I know you will do this because you've always done these wonderful things for me in the past. Lament him. Dum, 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 dum. 3rd type, thanksgiving hymn, where you thank God for saving you, and you will sometimes explicitly mention, you have delivered me from my enemies, you have healed me, and sometimes you explicitly say, as I prayed to you, and now I am in the temple giving thanks to you as I said I would. That gives it away as a Thanksgiving hymn. This is a generic Thanksgiving hymn. It mentions the enemies. It mentions those themes of the tyrant, the enemy, the foreigner, the oppressor will be thrown down, the poor, the Israelite, the sufferer will be lifted up. I call it a generic Thanksgiving hymn. So it's very much a typical psalm, and probably these kinds of things were generated through the days of Jesus. Did Mary sing this? Oh, she probably sang something on the spot, but I'm willing to bet money that Luke wrote this, crafted this, and said, I know a good psalm to put in right here. Or, remember, who's telling Luke the stories? Family members and friends and people who knew Jesus, and they've been telling these stories for 30, 40 years. Yeah. They've dressed them up. They may have put the psalm in because it's very Jewish, and it's very typically a psalm. But go back to that. Praise, lament, thanksgiving. Starting in 1922, we began to suspect that between a lament hymn and a thanksgiving hymn, the priest may have said some words saying, God will save you, God will help you, God will deliver you. And that would lead into the Psalm of Thanksgiving. So people might come together and pray a lament hymn, hear what we call the oracles of salvation from the prophet, from the priest, and then utter a thanksgiving hymn. Where would we find oracles of salvation? We think we're looking at them in Isaiah chapters 40 to 55. It has the language of the Psalms, but it has a distinctive flavor that you don't find in the Psalms. It has this language of you are forgiven, you will be restored, God will be taking care of you. We think the prophet was a priest and he used language from the worship of the temple, and they were the words of salvation. So you would go from lament hymn to the priest's words of salvation to the words of thanksgiving. Let's think about that for a while. Confession, absolution, thanksgiving. Where did we Christians get that from? Jewish Christians. So this is probably a worship pattern that existed among Jewish Christians, and by the 2nd century, everybody used this pattern. Confession, absolution, thanksgiving. In seminary, we called it the cat sequence. But that's interesting. Again, we don't know. We don't know what you can argue by looking at Jewish texts that have some of that language and say, Christians and Jews in the 2nd century were liturgically very similar in ways that we don't know about because they never bothered to write it down and tell us. It's the same old story. They didn't tell us the obvious. But anyway, this is perhaps a thanksgiving hymn of a generic sort, probably inserted by Luke. Or he may have inherited it from that Jewish community that remembered these stories about Jesus. You move to the 4th Sunday in Advent, and you have the Canticle of Zechariah. Then Zechariah, the father of John, filled with the Holy Spirit, prophesied, Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel, for he has visited and brought redemption to his people. He has raised up a horn for our salvation. Horn is a slang word for king. Karen. Within the house of David his servant, even as he promised through the mouth of his holy prophets from of old, salvation from our enemies and the hand of all that hate us, to show mercy to our fathers, to be mindful of his holy covenant, and the oath he swore to Abraham our father, and grant us that, rescued from the hand of enemies, without fear we might worship him in holiness and righteousness before him all our days. And you, child, will be called prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his ways, to give his people knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the daybreak from on high will visit us, to shine on those who sit in darkness and death's shadow, to guide our feet into the path of peace. Again, another beautiful hymn. Even more so, this is a kind of modified Thanksgiving hymn. You refer to the enemies repeatedly, and you also explicitly say, these are the things you've done for us in the past, God. We know you will continue to do these things in the future. This is typical in a lament hymn where you're trying to twist God's arm. Save me, help me, deliver me, because you've done these things in the past. Remember? We're your holy people ever since Abraham. You're not going to desert us. So they're classic hymns that look like they were crafted after the Psalter itself. The 150 hymns may have been closed in the middle of the 2nd century BC because they have that kind of different sort of genre, but it's still the same idea. We thank you, God, because you will deliver us from our enemies, because you've done this in the past. So both of these hymns are placed on the lips of individuals. They fit. One could certainly envision a Mary or a Zechariah saying these things, but it just looks like these are beautiful hymns crafted in the worshiping Jewish and Jewish Christian community, and somebody said, perfect place to put them in here. Now, as a preacher, when you look at these texts, what you're looking at are the cries and the hopes and the thanksgiving of very poor, bedraggled, and oppressed people. These are the hymns of the poor. That ain't us. But we can learn from them in that these are the hymns associated with the birth of Jesus. He has come for the poor in spirit, and as Luke would be quick to add, for the poor economically. Because as Luke sees the mission of the church, we are to proclaim the gospel, but also to reach out to the poor, to the outsider, to the vulnerable, to the helpless, to the brokenhearted. So, boom, right there with the hymns, we've got classic theology, just in the choice of the hymns. And something else worth mentioning, Zechariah, who gives this hymn. Zechariah goes into the temple, and the angel Gabriel speaks to him and says, guess what, homeboy, you're going to have a son. Zechariah says, I'm an old man. I'm too old to have a son. And the angel should have said, look, this is a theme in the Old Testament. Remember, these old people everywhere are having children for the first time. Okay, so shut up, they're going to have a son. But he tells him, you're going to have a son. And then he says, because you didn't believe me, I'm going to strike you dumb and you won't be able to say anything until the kid is born. And then Zechariah goes out to the people and they realize that he's had a revelatory experience, but he can't talk. But anyway, the plot goes on and on and on and on. Now what's interesting is that in the writings of Josephus, Antiquities, chapter 18, Jaddus, the high priest, who's really concerned about what's going to happen to his people, goes into the temple. The angel of God, which is God, speaks to him and says, there's a guy coming down the road. His name is Alexander the Great. Go out to greet him and meet him and praise him and have a big procession and to bring him into the city, because he is a great conqueror and he will give you Jews special exemption and he will help your people. But you have to have a parade for him, which, by the way, is called an adventus. This was common. People would go out to meet Roman emperors and they'd have a big parade to bring them into their city the last 10 months. So Jaddus goes out and he tells the people this, and they're all happy because they realize this is going to save them from the imperial might of Greek armies. They go out and they appease Alexander. And then he goes to meet Alexander, and Alexander says, I had a dream that I was going to meet a man in white raiment, and I should listen to him, and you're the guy. Okay, that's Josephus. Luke has read Josephus. Luke knows the story, and he crafts the story, but he adds his own particular details. It's not Alexander the Great coming down the road to destroy Jerusalem. It's John the Baptist. It's John the Baptist coming down the road. Now he's going to proclaim a word of judgment, but he is then the analog to Alexander the Great. And Luke's doing this with a grand sense of humor, but there's also a serious message here. We Christians, we don't work with great generals. We work with peasants, little people. Guys like John running around in camel hair clothes, eating locust and wild honey. He's the analog to Alexander. The point is, this is called intertextuality. When you're an author and you write a story, you say to yourself, I'm going to make this story sound like that story, so that people can see a comparison and a contrast and get a point. Well, it took us until 1894 to get the point when some author in Germany said, it's the same story. Luke has tinkered with it to preach a message. And now, instead of Janus, it's Zechariah, and instead of Alexander, it's John the Baptist. Instead of going out and telling the people everything's going to be fine, Zechariah's dumb. He can't say a word, because God's going to do it all. Don't worry, God's going to take care of it all. When I say gospel writers tinker with text, sometimes they tinker with them brilliantly. Brilliantly. The gospel text this last week, I think it was this last week, Lazarus comes out of the tomb, right? Lazarus is not a name. The guy's name is probably Simon. You know that from looking at the other Gospels, the brother of Mary and Martha, Simon. Why call him Lazarus? Why change his name? Because Lazarus means poor man, which is what each and every one of us is. Each and every one of us is being called out of that tomb. And when he comes out, it says he's wrapped up in the clothes, and in particular, his face is wrapped up in the face cloth. Time out. Everybody knows you don't wrap the face cloth around a person's head. You just put it on their face. It should have fallen off when he stood up. But no, the way John tells the story, he comes out and he's got the face cloth wrapped around his head. So when they take the face cloth off of his face, what's the first thing he sees? Jesus. Okay, 300 years before Jesus, a guy by the name of Plato invented the allegory of the cave. The cave is ignorance. We all live in a cave. We all get educated. When we're educated, it's like we come out of the cave and we see to the light of the sun, and we know truth, and we have life, and we have freedom because we see the light of the sun. Okay, we're Lazarus. We come out of the tomb. The face cloth is taken off. What do we see? First thing, Jesus, who is the light and the truth. And that when I say John likes to tinker, he tinkers with just little things. He inherits a story, but yeah, a few things here and there. And you make a powerful message out of it. So, that's what you have to be alert to. And I'd be willing to say there are lots of things that we haven't discovered in the Gospel of John yet. We're still picking up on them. Okay, so, the other two passages, let's jump to the third Sunday in Advent. John's preaching. Oh, when we thought we would get away without hearing anything about John the Baptist in Advent. Oh, we got to have at least one Sunday dedicated to John the Baptist. Yep. And Luke gives us a lot more than Mark does. Gives us about the same as Matthew about John's preaching. And John is very much a judgment prophet. And John's baptism is a baptism of repentance, which is why Paul and others, when they found Christians or found people who'd been baptized with John's baptism, had to rebaptize them, or felt they had to rebaptize them, because John's baptism was a baptism of repentance. The Christian baptism was a baptism of repentance and initiation into the body of Christ. I better watch it. I'm going to wander off into another side lecture. But anyway, so John's message is a little different, but Jesus builds on it. Now, here's the thing that I want to mention. And this isn't in your text, but it should be. Verse 19. Now Herod the Tetrarch, who had been censured by him because of Herodias, his brother's wife, and because of all the evil deeds Herod had committed, added still another to these by putting John in prison. Next verse. After all the people had been baptized, Jesus also had been baptized and was praying, and heaven was opened. And it talks about Jesus' baptism, and the Holy Spirit descended upon him in a bodily form like a dove, and a voice came from heaven, "You are my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." And it doesn't tell us who baptized Jesus. Just in case you hadn't noticed, Luke doesn't tell us who baptized Jesus because he's got him in prison. before the baptism. Luke's no dummy. He knows what you know. You all know that John the Baptist baptized Jesus. So when you're an author and you do something like this, you're waving a flag at your audience. Hey, 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 notice this. Why did I do this? And the audience is saying, he's got John the Baptist in prison before Jesus is baptized. What, does John have a long arm? What's going on here? Luke's theology. Later in Luke, Jesus will say of John, he was the greatest prophet of the Old Testament. The Old Testament has ended once Jesus is baptized. Now you've got the new age of Jesus. So John is using, Luke here is using this symbolism to say, John is in prison, the Old Testament age is over, Jesus is baptized, the New Testament age, or Jesus' age has begun. Pentecost will begin the age of the church. This is Luke creating three ages, which he does in his two books. There's the age of the Old Testament, ending with John, the age of Jesus, and then the age of the church, beginning with Pentecost. And you do it by playing this kind of a little trick where you've got John in prison, the very verse before Jesus gets baptized, and you don't use John's name. Anybody hearing this is going to just spot that right away. John in prison, the next verse he's got Jesus being baptized. What's his point? And by the end of Luke Acts, you get his point. There are three great ages, and we're in the third age. By the way, that never caught on. We work with two ages. Sorry, Luke. We have Old Testament, New Testament. You tried your best, but it didn't catch on. Another thing that Luke does, again, he's a Greek historian, but Greek historians always like to have an angle. Jesus rises from the dead. He appears to his disciples in Galilee in Mark. Well, it's anticipated in Mark. The story doesn't occur. In Matthew, he apparently is in Galilee, where he gives them the Great Commission and ascends. In Luke, he's on a hill outside of Jerusalem. Luke, we all know that Jesus went up to Galilee, where he ascended. Why are you putting him outside of Jerusalem? And Luke would say, I have this thing about Jerusalem. The mission starts there, and it ends up in Rome. And once we hit Rome, the empire is ours. So he's playing a geography game. But he knows that you're a first century Christian, that he's played with the information. That's how you preach a sermon. You catch your audience with a detail that they know that's not quite right. This is why I say John has the first three Gospels. I disagree with all those New Testament scholars who say he doesn't. He has to have the three of them because that's how he's making his point. When he differs from them, he wants you to notice he differs from them because he's got a powerful message to give. Back to the infancy narratives. So in Matthew, you got three wise men. They see the star in the east. They come to Jerusalem. They say, we know he's going to be born in Bethlehem. Herod says, well, I want to go to Bethlehem and worship him too. Yeah, right. Yeah. They follow the star from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. The star comes to the house where the child lay and is above the house, and they went in and worshiped him. Okay, what's the star? It ain't the planet Jupiter, sorry. It ain't a comet. It ain't, it's 30 feet off the ground. The Star of Bethlehem is 30 feet off the ground. Starting in the late 1700s, early 1800s, we became obsessed with trying to figure out what celestial phenomenon could have given rise to the Star of Bethlehem. And I had an article in Biblical Archaeology Review where a guy reviewed all the theories. So I wrote a letter to the editor, and I actually printed it and said, you got to read the text. Whatever the star is, it floats above the house, 30 feet above the house where Jesus lay. It's an angel. The Star of Bethlehem is an angel. We all knew that, we just forgot it. What do you put on the top of your Christmas tree? A star or an angel? I mean, that's an old custom. That goes way back to when people actually read the Bible better than we did, and they could look and see, yeah, the star's an angel. And we said, well, that doesn't make sense. Well, it did to them. And I said in my letter, look to the Old Testament. When God comes to judge the world, he will come with his heavenly host. What are the heavenly hosts? The stars. The heavenly hosts are the stars, and the heavenly hosts are also angels. The ancient Israelites saw stars as angels. A star could come down and become an angel. Well, we don't think that way. Well, they did. I'm sorry, they did. And the Bible was written for them in their language and their way of thinking. And so a star could come down and become an angel. By the way, if you look around at enough Christmas shows and cartoons, you notice we still have that theme. Star comes down and it's an angel. That's the way they thought. The heavenly host were the stars, and God would lead them. Now, the heavenly host, the stars, would come down and bring a great battle and a great war and destroy the evil and create the kingdom of God. And they're nasty little people, these angels. They're well armed. They've got dive bombers and God knows what else. What are they in Matthew and Luke? They're guides to the little baby, and they're the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. The angels are being used by the gospel writers now in a completely different sense. They're the ones who bring the age of peace and love. What do the angels say in Luke? Peace on earth, goodwill to men. Wait a minute, I thought you guys were warriors. No, now they're the people who proclaim the message of peace and goodwill. You kind of got to know the way the Israelites felt about the relationship of stars and angels to really get the message that Luke's coming across with when he has the angels singing a message of peace, because that's not what they used to do. And after I wrote this letter and Biblical Archaeology Review printed it, a person emailed me and he said, you know, I really was struck by your article, your letter. I never thought about it, but I think you're right. It is an angel. But did you ever think of the possibility that the Star of Bethlehem was a flock of angels? And that way, Luke and Matthew are a lot closer. And I said, I think you got a great idea there. You got a suggestion, because that would be an Israelite image. But again, my point is these infancy narratives have a lot of powerful, meaningful symbolism in them if you squeeze them just right. And a lot of the imagery is God acting on behalf of poor little people. Little people. Is Luke 21, where Jesus talks about the signs of the end. Now, you didn't have to be somebody who could look into the future and see the Jewish Revolution in 66, 70 AD. All you had to have was common sense in 30 AD to know there's going to be a war between the Jews and Rome, and we're going to get beat pretty badly. What is fascinating is if you compare the three Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke, with Mark has Jesus talk about the general destruction of Jerusalem. Matthew and Luke have specific details. They know what happened. And they know that Christians fled the city and went to Pella and were considered traitors by the Jewish community thereafter, and so forth. And so Luke and Matthew firm up Jesus' vision with actual details. Again, gospel writers tinker. And if Jesus had a vision that, Jerusalem's going to be destroyed by the Romans, Matthew and Luke are going to make sure that you realize, he was right. Let me give you some of the details that actually happened, and then you're going to put those words on Jesus' lips. So, be not offended by the fact that gospel writers will add stuff. Anyway, let me ask if you have any questions, because a question may start me off on another tangent.
Just an observation. I love the thing you said about the angels and the stars, and I'm thinking of the heavenly hosts of Luke praising God and singing. So these stars out there, I've always thought of stars. It makes it bigger for me.
Yeah.
The amount of angels.
Now, like the Babylonians, they would have considered the planets, the wandering planets, as gods, and they would have considered the stars to be lesser gods. So for the Israelites to call them angels is to debunk, it's part of your emerging monotheism. Okay, here's a tangent. The older Old Testament texts talk about cherubim and seraphim. A cherubim is a winged flying bull. A seraphim is a winged flying fiery snake. So in Isaiah, when the seraphim come to Isaiah to put the hot coal in his mouth, it says they have 3 sets of wings. Well, they have to, because they're long snakes. Snakes and bulls were common images used of gods, and perhaps even of the God of Israel himself. We have dug up a little golden bull from a highland Israelite village dated to about 1000 BC, and a little silver snake dug up in a Galilean village from the same age. These Israelites made images of God. That's why you had to have the command, don't make images of other gods and our own God. And what were the images we found? Bull, which, that was a common image going back to 8000 BC in central Turkey. Bull was a big, strong, powerful animal, and perfect image for God. And the snake was a perfect image for God, because the snake never died. You all know snakes never die. That's why you see snake skins. You can kill a snake, but it won't die on his own. So, perfect images for God. Well, the first stage of debunking them is you make them messengers of God. They serve God. The second stage, after 500 BC, you make the cherubim and the seraphim look like human beings. Then you really debunk them. And that's how you're fighting the battle against the gods. A Greek general in 167 BC and a Roman general in 63 BC didn't wander in, they were generals. They kicked their way into the temple, the Holy of Holies. They looked at the Ark of the Covenant, and being generals who were looking for gold and silver, they didn't find any of that. And Pompey in 63 said, oh, all they had were 2 naked figures with their arms extended to each other. Now, what Pompey saw were their wings that came across and touched. And we know that from rabbinic sources, 2 angels touched. But they were human figures. So that makes us think that the Ark of the Covenant after 500 BC had human figures. Before the destruction of the temple, they probably had the animal figures. So again, it's a process of first the animals are images for God, then you knock them down to be just angels, messengers, and then you knock them down to become just human figures. So by the time the infancy narratives are written, these angels look humanoid. But anyway. Oh, I thought you had a question.
Bob, I was just thinking too, when you were talking about stars and angels, when Simeon holds the Christ child on the 40th day of the presentation, he says, a light of revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people Israel. It's the same thing, and I've pointed it out in homilies before.
I can't.
Oh, okay.
Hearing aids. I didn't hear you too good.
He's talking about Simeon.
Simeon holding the child.
Holding the child.
When he says, a light of revelation to the Gentiles and the glory of your people, Israel, that's the same kind of thing. That, the light of revelation is very similar to the star.
Okay, I'm still not getting the question.
He's making an observation that when Simeon presents Jesus, that he will be a light of revelation, keeping in that same symbolism with the stars.
Yeah, you got the light theme running through more New Testament texts than you'd think. Like I said, the resurrection of Lazarus. He comes out and sees Jesus as the light. And the Magi, who are the patrons of darkness, are bent to the light of Jesus. And the early church realized that and worked with that image, because when we created the Festival of Epiphany, we stole a Roman festival dedicated to the veneration of the Roman emperor, who was connected to the god Apollo, the sun. And that was supposed to be, what was that, 10 days after Saturnalia or whatever. And at Saturnalia, we turned into Christmas, and then the veneration of the Roman emperor, where the Roman emperor was Apollo, the sun, and venerated by the Magi, who are now Persian priests. We said, okay, we're going to steal that. Jesus is the sun. The Magi come to visit him, and he's manifest, and his epiphany is on this day, and that's where we got Epiphany. But it was really working with the image of light. Jesus brings the light, not the Roman emperor. But yeah, that's a good observation. There's a lot of light imagery. And in the Gospel of John, I'm the way, the truth, the light, and the life. Yeah, John's working with that light imagery too. That had become big in Greek philosophy. Beginning with Plato, with you had insight and wisdom, you could see the light. And Plato was around 320 BC. Any other questions?
When you say about the wings. Hold on, I can't hear you back here. I'm sorry. Yeah, I can't hear very well. I'm sitting okay, you hear me? All right. I just think of Isaiah, the call passage of Isaiah with the winged person and the 6 legs and all that. Is that connected to this with the angel thing?
Well, yeah, you got it's the angel, and that's chapter 6 of Isaiah, which at one point was actually the beginning of the book of Isaiah, and he has this classic call experience where he is symbolically drawn up into the heavenly temple, and God issues a commission. Who will go, who will speak for us, and he volunteers at first, and then a little later he says no, because you got 2 call narratives imposed upon each other. One is his real call narrative where he actually volunteers, and the other is every good prophet who's a prophet had to deny that he wanted to be a prophet so that God could overturn his denial and make him a prophet, and he could say, I didn't want to be here saying these horrible things to you, but God, you know how he is. He just forced me to be a prophet. So Isaiah, in his second call, where he denies he wants to be a prophet, says, I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean hearts. So God says, okay, got unclean lips. Hey, Joe, put a fiery thing on his tongue. Isaiah says, oh, I wish I hadn't brought that up. And God purifies his tongue so he can speak. It's that image of light and purification. Fire is associated with purification in a lot of Old Testament texts. While you're on Isaiah there, Isaiah at one point says, I was sent to preach a message so that people's hearts would be hardened and they would be condemned. I was sent to preach a message because they would stubborn and wouldn't listen. Okay, this is where Christians have plopped in and developed their doctrine of predestination. We're dopes. It's rhetoric. It's rhetoric. Isaiah is saying, I'm here preaching a message to you because I know you won't hear me, and that way you can be cursed and destroyed by God. Why am I bothering to speak in the first place? Well, I'm using rhetoric to get your attention. I'm using rhetoric to get your attention. One of our problems is we read biblical texts too flat and fail to appreciate that prophets, including Jesus, would say extreme things to get your attention. If your eye offend, they pluck it out. No, he didn't mean that. You know, and because he's a good Jewish rabbi. Yeah, the camel can get through the eye of a needle faster than a rich man can get to heaven. There's a rabbinic saying that goes, an elephant can get through the eye of a needle easier than something. I mean, Jesus very much in the Jewish tradition. In the 19th century, tourists who went to Palestine were entertained by Arab guides who would tell them, and here we have the famous camel gate, that you could get a camel through at night after the main gate was closed, but only with great difficulty. You'd have to unload the camel and bring all your goods in, and then the camel would have to crawl through on his knees. But a camel can get through the gate with great difficulty. So that's what Jesus was saying. A rich man can get to heaven, but only with great difficulty. And the people went back home, and pastors and ministers went back home and preached that from their pulpits, and the Arab tour guides went home and told their wife, and they all laughed their ears off. Because they made it up. The camel gate didn't exist until 800 AD. You know, it was just a story that tour guides made up in 1850 for gullible Americans. Those of you who have ever owned a pet camel know that he can't walk on his knees. He'll break them. And those of you who've owned a pet camel, you can't make a camel do anything he doesn't want to do. Okay, but anyway, I diverge. I think it's probably time for a break.
What time how long do you want us before we reconvene?
What's that?
What time do you want us to reconvene? Like how
Oh,
many
I don't
minutes?
know. Whenever you'd like.
There's coffee and sodas in the narthex. You can enjoy those. Also, the bathrooms are down the hallway. Women's will be on your immediate right, and men's will be on your left. What do you say, Bob?
What's
15,
that?
10 minutes? 5?
Sure,
10
fine.
minutes.
That'll give you enough time to go to the bathroom.
All right. So we'll see you in 10.
Sorry, Bob. We're having so much of a problem hearing you because you're soft-spoken.
so I have to have deep penetrating hearing aids that pour the noise in. I better keep them in because I don't know where my
Well,
phone's going to go when I can't hear myself.
well, the microphone works good if you put it close.
Welcome back. I'm glad you're all here. I want to make a couple of announcements. The first is if you want to see the lecture a second time because there's so much goodness in it, you can find it on our website at ctk-nola, NOLA.org. So you can see the lecture a second time here on our website. And then mark your calendars. The first is January 10th through the 12th at Peace Slidell. We'll be having a family camp. Luther Hill is coming out, and all people are invited, not just people with children, but all people. And so be sure to look forward to that. More information will be coming out. And then March 8th until the 15th, we are in the very early planning stages of going to Luther Rock or Luther Ridge in North Carolina and helping those communities recover from a hurricane. The family camp is all ages. The March trip will be for adults. So I want to encourage you to put those on your calendars, and if you'd like to watch again, you can go to ctk-nola.org.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay. All right. So the Old Testament lessons, which some may choose to preach on, some may not. I like to preach on Old Testament lessons as often as I can because I just know altogether too much about those texts, so I can just blabber off the top of my head. We have 4 particular readings, and what I've done is arrange them sort of in the sequence that these oracles may have been uttered. Now, here's the situation with prophets. This is worth saying this. Prophets were oral spokespersons. They stood up and spoke publicly. Their oracles were actually poems. If you have a good English translation and you open to the prophetic corpus, you'll notice that they're set up like poetry. This was a pre-literate society they lived in. Maybe only 2 or 3% of the people could read. They would have been the professional scribes and some high-born educated elite. And so when the prophets spoke, they had to utter their oracles in poetic form so that people who heard them could remember the oracle. People who are pre-literate are not stupid. They're very smart, but they're very good at memorizing. They have to be. Some Arab boys in Saudi Arabia have memorized the entire Quran, which for them, 114 chapters or surahs, which for them is easy. You know, when you don't read, you have good memory muscles. Our minds just beg to memorize things. That's why we get song lyrics stuck in our head that we don't want there. It's our poor little minds just dying to memorize something. Okay, so prophets spoke oracles that were remembered orally. Isaiah may have been able to write. The prophet in the exile who wrote chapters 40 through 55 of Isaiah, he probably knew how to write. Much later prophets knew how to write because it was dangerous to speak publicly. But the earliest prophets, Amos, Hosea, Micah, Jeremiah, they spoke orally, and their stuff was remembered. In fact, with Jeremiah in particular, Jeremiah spoke his oracles, but we know that his scribe Baruch wrote a number of them down. So here's my point. You make a distinction between the author and the writer. The person who speaks is the author. The person who writes it down is the writer. We tend to blur those two together when we say author. But it's worth keeping the distinction. There's a difference between author and writer, and they can be centuries apart. So, and I say that in particular in regard to the Pentateuch. The Jews felt that Moses was the author of the Pentateuch, but they believed that Ezra wrote it. And he wrote it down around 450, 400 BC. So, we have prophets who speak things orally, and they get written down. When do they get written down? We think, this is a complex debate, I'll make it simplistic. We think most of the prophetic oracles get written down in the middle of the 500s when Jews are in exile because they want to particularly remember what the prophets said. And so then these guys write the stuff down. They tinker with it. They change some of the oracles to update them. They add their own oracles. We know they add their own oracles because the book of Jeremiah evolves and grows over 400 years. The earliest Greek translations of the book of Jeremiah are 1/6 shorter than the Jeremiah that ends up in our Hebrew Bible. People kept adding oracles to these books because they felt it's a living prophetic word. You can add stuff. So that's what makes it tricky for us. When we look at a prophetic book, we say, okay, did this oracle come from Micah? Or did it come from the guy who wrote his book down 200 years later? Okay, so that's what we're saying. And if you ask the question, who's inspired? They all are. You know, it's a process. Whoever's involved in creating a text, we would say they're inspired by God. It's a symbolic statement that we're making. So having said that, what's the oldest text that we have in the Advent text? Probably Zephaniah. It's a very short book, comes from about 620 BC to 610 BC, somewhere in there. As the Assyrian Empire is collapsing, the great oppressive, horrible empire that brutalized everybody, including the Jews, he sings a hymn, he sings a song talking about the day of the Lord coming in his age. And in chapter 3, verses 14 to 20, he's talking to Jerusalem and saying, rejoice, rejoice. We are free, we are liberated. Point to be made, he's talking about a political situation that went on in the late 7th century BC, but words once spoken remain alive forever. I use the term polyvalency. You can utter an oracle at this time, and to us, we can sing it again and apply it to a completely different situation. And it's valid for us because living literature is like that. The Emmanuel oracle in Isaiah chapter 7, when Isaiah spoke it, the Emmanuel was probably the Assyrian army. He then reuses his own oracle 15 years later, adds to it, and Emmanuel becomes King Hezekiah. Late in his old age, he probably develops the Emmanuel image some more in chapter 9, chapter 11, and now it's any future ideal Judean king. We think that maybe somebody applied it to King Josiah in 620 BC, but we don't have that literature. We just think they might have. After 500 BC, the Emmanuel will be some great king that will come and save and deliver us and create a golden age. When Christians come along, we say, it's Jesus. Now, what we as Christians have to appreciate is it meant different things to different people along the way. We have to respect that it meant something to them. We can say it's the final culmination. We can say it's the best culmination. We could do whatever, and we have a right to do that, but we got to respect that it meant something to other people too, because that's how God works. He didn't plop something down in the 8th century BC and say, okay, we're going to put this under wraps for 800 years and it'll finally mean something to Christians in the 1st century. God says, I care for these people that live in 700 BC. It's going to mean something for them too. It's got to give them hope. It's got to give them some sort of meaning. And as an artist, I call this polyvalent. A piece of brilliant literature can have different levels of meaning and mean different things to different people along the line. And that's what we have to respect. What that also means is, if the guy in exile in 550 BC talks about the servant of the Lord, and we say, well, that's Jesus, and the Jewish tradition says that's Israel, we're both right. We both have access to that passage. It's sacred text for both of us. And I'd say in faith, that's the will of God, that it can mean different things for different people. So, that's one thing to appreciate about the prophets. They say things that can mean different things legitimately to different people over the centuries. And some of these texts we're looking at. Zephaniah is talking about, let's rejoice because the evil, wicked Assyrian Empire has fallen. We can read it today and say, rejoice because it is the presence of God in our midst in the person of Jesus. And our interpretation is as valid as theirs. But the historian in me says, realize that first it meant something to those folk. And because it meant something to those folk, it was valuable, and that's why they chose to write it down. And we wouldn't have it if they hadn't written it down because it meant something for them. The next passage, probably Jeremiah. Now, the book of Jeremiah is an interesting book because it is very, very long. 52 chapters, which means, this is an odd thing to say, it probably started, his oracles were written down very shortly after his career and his death by someone who knew him, i.e. Baruch, his scribe, and a couple of times Baruch was commissioned by Jeremiah to write something down, and so a lot of stuff gets remembered. You got Amos with 9 chapters, and Hosea with 14 chapters, and Micah with 5 chapters, and there's Jeremiah with 52. Yeah, his stuff didn't have to stay in oral tradition that long. But the book kept growing, and we know that because at a point in time, somebody in 300 BC translated it, probably using a 100-year-old manuscript, 200-year-old manuscript, and the manuscript kept growing after that. So the manuscript that the Jews used was that longer manuscript, and that's the manuscript that the Protestants used, and so, yeah. These books are fluid. They grow. They're like plants. So, yeah, you can have 2 versions of the book of Jeremiah. He was, for most of his life, a prophet of doom. He was a prophet probably from 508 or 608 or 606 BC to 580. There's a debate there, so I don't want to get into that. Most of his oracles are oracles of judgment, but in chapters 31 through 33, he has hope oracles called the Little Book of Consolation. By the time Jerusalem was falling to the Babylonians and being destroyed, and everybody said, oh, damn, it looks like that prophet Jeremiah was right after all. We didn't believe him all these years, and now the city's falling, and yeah, we're doomed and we're destroyed, and yeah, you were right, Jeremiah, we're being punished by God. Then he becomes a prophet of hope. Prophets can be really contrary. They're prophets of doom and judgment when you're proud and confident, and then when you're broken, then they turn into prophets of hope. Ezekiel does the same thing. But in the Little Book of Consolation, we have a lot of the classic images that we really associate with Jeremiah. The New Covenant, the 70-year exile, believe it or not, because he's saying, in effect, that the exile will only last for 70 years. It won't last forever, so you're going to come back someday. And this one about a shoot will emerge from the house of David. What was in Jeremiah's head? Oh, we don't know. Well, maybe he was actually thinking of a child of the last king who would eventually come back and be a governor for a period of time, Zerubbabel. And if so, that would be a wonderful fulfillment of that hope. But hope oracles last forever. They move on. And Christians pick them up and say, now the shoot is Jesus. Now the shoot is Jesus. Oh, I gotta say this. If you read the prophets from one end to the other and read them flat, you'll come away and say, boy, is the God of the Old Testament a God of doom and judgment and wrath and anger, because 70% of your prophetic oracles are doom, wrath, and judgment. And no, only a small percentage are hope oracles. Realize that when these guys write this stuff down in 550 BC, they see the judgment oracles as having been fulfilled. The hope oracles talk about the future. It's the hope oracles that they want you to pay attention to. Know that the hope oracles will come true because all the damn judgment oracles came true. So it's contextual. The guys who create this literature don't want you to focus and obsess on the judgment oracles. They want you to look at the hope oracles. Know that the hope oracles, which speak to the future, will come to pass because all the judgment oracles did. So, Jeremiah's little book of consolation, chapters 31 through 33, I'll say, are the most important part of the book. Most important part of the book. And he was talking about things in his own age, but they mean something for us. What is interesting is he uses the term New Covenant. Nobody picks up on that phrase except for some obscure scribe at Qumran who writes it down in something. Who knows if anybody knew about that. It doesn't get used until Jesus uses it in the Eucharistic words. And that's interesting. After the exile, the Jews will talk about a renewed covenant. But they don't say new covenant. They don't pick up on Jeremiah's expression, new covenant. Some of them do, but their stuff probably doesn't get remembered. It's just a minor thing. But the Christians will pick up on it. So that's an interesting thing to observe. Okay, Micah. I got 2 dates up here for Micah. Micah was a judge who lived around 705 BC in Judah, in a little city called Moresheth-Gath. He uttered the oracles that are found in chapters 1, 2, 3, and 6. 4, 5, and 7 get added later. The language is very different. He's a contemporary of Isaiah. This is interesting. Isaiah 705 to 701 is saying, Jerusalem will not fall. The temple will not be destroyed. The king will not be destroyed. There will be horrible destruction, but we will survive the Assyrian attack. And so he gets vindicated by history when the Assyrians get driven away by the plague in 701 BC. Micah, sitting up Moresheth-Gath, is saying, doom, doom, destruction, and despair. We're all going to be destroyed. We're all going to be fried and barbecued. Da, 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 da. Isaiah and Micah disagree with each other. And yet both end up in the Bible. As the Jewish tradition developed and looked back, it said they were both true prophets. There's my point about, there's a certain kind of flexibility. They realize that people who can almost say the opposite message are both true. From Micah's perspective, out in the rural area, 46 out of 47 cities got destroyed. Yeah, okay, yeah. From his perspective, doom, destruction, and despair everywhere. Isaiah lives in Jerusalem. 46 out of 47 cities get destroyed, but Jerusalem survives. They're both true. And the rhetoric of the two books disagree with each other, but Jews would later consider them authoritative. Even in the days of Jeremiah, at one point they wanted to lynch Jeremiah. That's 100 years later, around 600, 595 BC. They want to lynch Jeremiah, and they don't because they say, Jeremiah is a lot like Micah. Micah prophesied doom and destruction. Jeremiah does too. Maybe we should let him go. That tells us that even in the oral memory, these two different prophets, Isaiah and Micah, could be held in tension and both respected. And their oracles were probably remembered orally. Well, somebody writes Micah's stuff down, probably in exile in 550 BC, and they add 4, 5, and 6. 4, 5, and 7. And so it's an oracle here which is about deliverance from Assyria. So this guy's writing in 550 BC. Assyria's gone. The enemy now is Babylon. But he's writing in Micah's name, who lived around 705, so he uses Assyria. Because if Micah would have spoken, he would have said Assyria. But our author knows that his audience is going to read and hear the article and say, yeah, it's really about Babylon. Again, there's a principle of polyvalency, I think, that's even in the author's head. He can project an oracle back to the time of Micah, but he knows that he's really talking about his own age and that his audience will pick up on that. And so Assyria becomes a cipher or code word for Babylon. Well, we read it today, and again, polyvalency, it means something different for us today. It reminds us that God delivers and defeats all evil. The text lives forever, and it means something to each and every generation. And the last text is Malachi. We used to say Malachi was the last of the prophets. Nah, there were prophets after him. And we used to date Malachi to 400 BC. Now we date him to 450 BC. The joke is, oh, this is one of the few places where critical scholars actually push the guy back in time and rather forward in time. But Malachi, we don't know his name because Malachi is a title. This book has an interesting book. The prophet spoke probably at the time when Judah was undergoing tremendous stress, trying to find its identity. It was perhaps before the reforms of Ezra and Nehemiah. And he fusses at people for making things trivial and not focusing on what's really important in religion. In this instance, the emphasis is upon him as a messenger, and I'll come back to that. And probably what happens is his 3 chapters get combined with the chapters from 3 other prophets. See, they wrote this stuff down on scrolls, and sometimes they would combine small prophets into one scroll. Who am I kidding? We do that in the New Testament. 2 Corinthians is Paul's first, third, and fourth letter to the Corinthians. The ancient Christians just put them all on the same scroll because scrolls cost money. So a prophet, Zechariah 1 through 8, a prophet, Zechariah 9 through 12, a prophet, Zechariah 12 through 14, and a prophet, Malachi 1 through 3, were put on the same scroll. And then at some point, and the best guess is the 2nd century, Jews are organizing their prophets, and they want 12 minor prophets. And they only have 10. Okay, let's steal Jonah. Let's put Jonah among the prophets. Are you kidding me? It's a story. But he's a prophet, so he gets stuck with the prophets. And then they snap off the last 3 chapters that once were a separate prophet, Malachi, and they make him a separate prophet again, possibly because being good Jews, they could spot the language is different. This is a different prophet. And so they get their 12 prophets. In a Jewish Bible today, if you open it up, you'll find they have a book called basically the 12 prophets. Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. That's all one book. And Malachi is at the end. We Christians have turned them into 12 separate prophets. Why was Malachi at the end? Oh, people write dissertations on that. Because the sequence is chronologically jimmy-whacked. The best theory is linguistic words. You find some words in this prophet, and you find the same words in the next guy. Okay, let's put his book after his book. Oh, look, we got words in this book, and it's like words in that book. Let's put them together. Because they listened. We read, they listened. So they arranged things by sound. So Malachi ended up the last book, Zechariah, Malachi. Yeah, well, it was attached to Zechariah in the first place because there was similarity. Christians saw that, and they saw Malachi's reference to the messenger, and they said, that's John the Baptist. We will never know who the historical Malachi was talking about, but doesn't matter. Texts are living. Texts have life. They can mean different things to different people, and to Christians, they legitimately now refer to John the Baptist. And so Malachi is one of those obscure little prophets who speaks of how a messenger will come to previsage Jesus, and that's John the Baptist. So, I mean, this becomes a springboard for talking about John the Baptist. I was going to say something else. What was I going to say? Oh, yeah, scrolls. This will lead me into Brooke. So people had scrolls. They didn't have books till 300 AD. So if you popped in a time machine in 400 BC and you went to a scribe in Jerusalem and said, show me your holy literature, he'd hold your armload of scrolls. If you went to a Christian church in 200 AD and said, show me your sacred scripture, he'd show you an armload of scrolls. If you traveled around, you'd begin to realize, well, wait a minute, different people have different, different scrolls. Everybody would agree. Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, Pentateuch, they all had those. Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, they all had those. And the prophets, well, they had all of those. But after 300 BC, it was a little vague as to which ones were their sacred texts. So Jews start translating Hebrew works into Greek from 270 BC in Egypt down to 100 BC in great numbers, but some of the stuff still would be continued to be translated down to 180. So the Old Testament, as we call it, was translated into Greek over a period of about 400 years. Then some Jews started writing books in Greek. Okay, so they're part of the corpus too. Now, when it finally comes down to the Jewish-Christian split, Jews are only going to want to use those books that were written in Hebrew. They're not going to want to use the Jewish books written in Greek. Christians, who from the get-go use Greek translations. Matthew, when he quotes the Old Testament, he's Jewish Christian, but he quotes the Old Testament, he's quoting a Greek translation. Christians use the Greek translation, which means they're going to use Jewish works written only in Greek. Tobit, Judith, 1st and 2nd Maccabees, Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, and Baruch. So Baruch's going to be an Old Testament book for Christians, but not for Jews. And again, these people are walking around with armloads of scrolls. So there's going to be a difference from church to church to church. And you say, okay, when do they start using books? Well, the Jews start making books after they generate the Mishnah around 200 AD. Christians start generating books made out of like sheepskin, big pages, vellum. You could write in a small print and get a lot on a sheepskin, both sides. After 300, and we have 3 books from after 300, where, you know, when you make a book, you got to decide, okay, which individual works do I want in my canon? Let's look at these 3 books. Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, those are the 2 oldest. Codex Alexandrinus. By the way, Codex Alexandrinus and Codex Sinaiticus are both within 10 feet of each other in the British Library. 15 feet away from the Magna Carta. God, don't start a fire down there. But, so you get the 3 books and say, okay, I'm going to discover what books the Christians used in their canon by looking at these books. They disagree. We start making books and they disagree. They disagree. Of the 3 codices, one has 35, one has 33, and one has 31 New Testament books. We have 27. Huh. It's not till 400 AD that Christians in council at Hippo and Carthage and later Ephesus in 431 say, we're going to limit the New Testament to these 27 books. And the others? Yeah, First and Second Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, Barnabas, Didache, Shepherd of Hermes. Yeah, these are still inspired by God, still worthy of preaching, and should be used by the church, but we're not going to put them in our official canon. When was the last time you heard a sermon on First Clement? Once they got put outside the canon, they got kind of lost at the church life. But Christians narrowed. So what am I saying is when we first started producing books, we still hadn't made up our minds about which individual writings were in and out. So Christians make up their minds around 400 AD. And what do Christians say about the Old Testament? These councils said, we will continue to use the Old Testament books that we've always used in the past.
It's not working. Go ahead.
And so they were in Protestant Bibles up until about 1818. And then in America, I think it was the American Bible Society decided to leave the Apocrypha out in order to save money. Well, there's a good theological reason. And so King James Bibles in America floated around without the Apocrypha, forever convincing conservative Protestants that the Apocrypha are not Scripture. Then when the Revised Standard Tradition, the translation came out in 1952, within a few years they added the Apocrypha in again, and conservative Protestants threw a hissy fit. Those books don't belong in our Bible. They were never in our Bible. Well, they were until 1818. Give me a break. And then the New English Bible, likewise, you can find a New English Bible with Apocrypha in the middle. And Roman Catholic translations, the New American Bible, which I have here, the Jerusalem Bible, they just put the 7 Apocryphal books here, there, and everywhere in the Old Testament where they belong. But conservative Protestant translations won't touch the Apocrypha. So New International Version, New American Standard Bible, they don't have the Apocrypha in it. But anyway, that's the story. So if you wonder why there are different listings of Old Testament books, we never decided. Those guys at Hippo and Carthage, they were just tired and they wanted to go home, and they didn't want to get into the business with the Old Testament books. And so the short canon is the one that those were the books that were always in Hebrew. And then the other additional ones, they were works that were translated or they were written in Greek by Jews and by Christians. The 7 are called the Apocrypha. We in the West look at what the Greek Orthodox and the historians and the Copts have, and those extra books that they have, and we call those pseudepigrapha, because we're arrogant. But anyway, that's the reason. Baruch's text probably dates to about 130 BC, is calling upon Judah to rejoice, and probably the context in the 2nd century is to rejoice over their freedom and their independence, which has been recently gained with Maccabean victory, 164 BC. And for us, it's, rejoice. It's Jesus is coming. It's Christian season. Books can mean different things for different people. Okay, any questions? I can't believe I got a whole canon history in there. That's it, yeah. We just, we Catholics and Protestants, we just give such short shrift, especially to the New Testament Apocrypha, we call it, those books. They're 2nd century books. The ancient fathers at Hippo in Carthage in 391 and 393 or wherever said, we want books that were used everywhere by everybody at all times. What that really means in real English, we're going to put in the books that people really like the most and use the most, which is really a good decision. But they sort of implied we want a book that testifies to Jesus, was written by somebody from the 1st century. First Clement was written in 96 AD. 2nd Thessalonians was probably written in 120 AD. So, yeah, okay, they screwed up a little bit there. But their point was well taken. They wanted 1st century stuff because that came from people who were 1st and 2nd generation Christians and good Jewish Christians and whatever. And from personal testimony, I have sworn to Good Shepherd people I'm going to preach on 1st Clement at some time. And then I open that book and read it and say, ugh, I can't preach on these texts. So they kind of had some common sense. They got the books out that would really, really, really be hard to preach on. Okay, any other questions? What's that? Well, there were 26 Gospels written, and the church popularly settled on Matthew, Mark, and Luke because they just read better, and they made better sense. And some of these other Gospels, if you read them, you can say, yeah, I can see why that one didn't make the cut. A lot of them were just meant to be entertaining. There's the Gospel. Oh, I get them all confused, but 2 of them talk about Jesus' childhood. Yeah, he makes clay pigeons and turns them alive and they fly away. And he gets mad at a little friend and kills him and then has to raise him from the dead. And so forth. And you can just see Mary coming up and say, Jesus, the neighbors are starting to talk. You need to cut this stuff out. But those infancy narratives from the 2nd century, they're meant to be entertaining. And, everybody wants to talk about a great hero when he was a child. So they didn't take them seriously. But they have useful information in them. Every one of them portrays Jesus' brothers and sisters as older brothers and sisters from Joseph from a previous marriage. And that may be, a real good memory, an authentic memory. And it was what Greek Orthodox buy into today. So critical scholars think that may be where we should take them that seriously. Some of these Gospels are written by extremists in the Christian tradition who thought they were mainstream at the time, but they were pretty extreme. And some of them, I think, are farces. The Gospel of Judas. Now, here's the thing. I got to tell you this story. We've known about the Gospel of Judas for years because a guy in the late 2nd century named Irenaeus of Lyon wrote this Adversus Heresies, and he talked about all of these Gospels, and he refuted all of these crazy ideas that Gnostics had. In 1947, we dug up a bunch of these Gnostic works. We never, at Nag Hammadi, we never had them before, and we began to realize Irenaeus knew what he was talking about, and he was also fair and objective, much more so than our modern politicians. And he really is a good source for these teachings. And he mentions the Gospel of Judas, which claims that Jesus and Judas had a plot, and that Jesus didn't really die, and on and on and on. It's crazy. So about 20 years ago, somebody discovers a copy of the Gospel of Judas, and the news media go crazy. We've got the gospel that explains the truth to us. Patristic scholars, we patristic scholars. No, wait a minute. No. We've known about this for years. This is nothing new. We just never had a copy of it. Irenaeus tore it apart already in 180 AD. Hey, listen to us. But people never listen to people who know what they're talking about. They like to listen. They like to listen to the sensationalists. This Gospel of Judas explains the whole Jesus Passover plot. It's a new discovery. No, it's not. We've known about it for years. That might be the fifth gospel that you heard about, because they were making a big thing about how the Gospel of Judas was such a big new breakthrough. Yeah. No, it was, Irenaeus tore it apart in 180 AD. Well, let's stop here.
Well, first of all, Bob, thank you for I will yield to people who understand how things are set up back there as far as logistics for our lunch. This is a thank you on behalf of the Bayou Conference. Thank you again for your time. We appreciate it. Yes.
I was just going to take home leftover food.
You can do that too if you want. Yes.
Can we make an announcement about the ecumenical service in January, Sandra?
Please do so.
Okay. Buddy Noel, the ecumenical officer for the Catholic Archdiocese, and of course Sandra is our Lutheran counterpart in dialogue with your synod, so in this deanery. So on Tuesday, January 21st at 6:30 at my place, Our Lady of Prompt Suffer in West Wego, we're having the annual Week of Prayer for Christian Unity service. Bishop Mike is coming, and he will be preaching in my church, so I'm excited that Bishop Mike's coming, and I'd love for y'all to be there as well. Bring out the Lutherans, okay? So that's going to be Tuesday, January 21st at 6:30 at my place.
I have to mention this. Buddy taught for us at Loyola when
He was my boss.
I taught a wonderful course on the liturgy, and students loved it. He was a great teacher. So
I made him go to all the different liturgies, including Lutheran ones.
and that course went as long until I think Katrina kind of shut us all down. Okay.
You are welcome to get your food and bring it back into this space. We kindly request that you clean up after yourself. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Bob. We look forward to fellowship in the narthex.